Top 5 most frightening kidnapping cases ever. The idea of being taken against your will is terrifying, and unfortunately it happens to people all around the world. And when the abductors take their victims and keep them alive to serve their twisted purpose, it reaches a whole new level of sinister. The cases on this list show just how depraved some humans can be. These are the top 5 most frightening kidnapping cases ever. Number 5. The Niigata girl confinement incident. At 9 years old, Fusako Sano was just a 4th grade elementary school student. On November 13, 1990, in her hometown of Sanjo in Niigata Prefecture, Japan, she was watching a local baseball game at her school. But then, between the school and heading home, Sano mysteriously disappeared. Police frantically searched for the young girl, and while they couldn't find her, just 55 kilometers from where she was taken, Sano was still alive. It turns out she was taken by a man named Nobuyuki Sato. The mentally disturbed, unemployed 28-year-old forced the girl into his car and then took her to his home nearby. Sano was kept tied up for months. To control her, a stun gun was used for her punishment whenever she acted up. She was given food 3 times a week, mostly instant meals or those cooked by the suspect's mother, who lived in the downstairs area of the home. She was not allowed to go anywhere outside of the suspect's room, and the only time she could go to bathe or the toilet was whenever her captor permitted it. Most of her time, she recounted, was spent listening to the radio. She was only allowed to watch TV in the last year of her captivity. Although the door was never locked, she was so scared to escape or step outside, and told police she lost the energy to escape. Authorities believe the suspect's mother might have known about having the young Sano captive. It was later revealed every time his mother tried to head upstairs, her son would throw a violent fit. Eventually, though, it was his mother that led to police finding Sano. In January of 1996, the suspect's mother called the police public health center to consult and tell them her son was acting strangely and often violent to her. On January 12th and 19th of 2000, she called again, asking for them to visit her home. It wasn't until January 28th when officials finally visited. The disturbed suspect caused a ruckus, and police were called to the scene. By this time, Sano finally found the courage to step forward and tell them who she was. She could hardly walk, and although physically she looked 19 years old, mentally she was still a child. For 9 years and 2 months, all she knew was her captor and the little room where she was kept. After she got out, Sano had trouble adjusting to normal life, but enjoyed digital photography, long walks, and watching soccer games. As for the suspect, he was hospitalized, then arrested a month after. His trial headed to the Supreme Court of Japan, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Number 4. Patty Hearst. At 16, Patty Hearst lived a life of comfort as she was the granddaughter to publishing giant William Randolph Hearst. On February 4, 1974, she heard a knock on her apartment door in Berkeley, California. Her fiancé opened it, and 2 armed men and 1 woman broke in. They beat up her fiancé and a neighbor who tried to help. Afterward, the men dragged away Patty, placing her in the trunk of their car. For 3 days, no one knew who took Patty until a letter was sent to a Berkeley radio station by a group calling themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA. The leftist group claimed responsibility for Patty's kidnapping and demanded the Hearst family give $70 worth of food to every person in California in need of it, something that would have cost an estimated $400 million. The family complied with what they could and gave away about $2 million worth of food. The SLA demanded it wasn't enough and told them to give $6 million more. But the Hearst Corporation said they would only do so if Patty was released unharmed. During her captivity, Patty said she was raped and indoctrinated into the SLA. But by April, the situation radically changed. Patty announced her name was now Tanya, and she was now part of SLA on her own free will. She was caught on surveillance participating in an armed robbery at a San Francisco bank, as well as another robbery in Los Angeles. By May 17th, police located the SLA's headquarters. When it was raided, 6 out of the 9 members were killed during the onslaught. This included the leader, ex-convict Donald DeFries. Patty Hearst and 2 other members weren't at the headquarters at the time, so they weren't killed in the raid. Patty continued to crisscross the country with her captors and co-conspirators until she was finally arrested on September 18, 1975. Although Hearst claimed she was brainwashed, she was still convicted for armed robbery on March 20, 1976, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. She served only 21 months. In 2001, President Clinton gave her a full pardon despite opposition from then U.S. Attorney Robert Mueller. Number 3. Colleen Stan. On May 19, 1977, 19-year-old Colleen Stan wanted to surprise a friend for her birthday and decided to hitchhike from her hometown in Eugene, Oregon, to her friend's home in Northern California. Considering herself an expert hitchhiker, she turned down 2 drivers she thought didn't feel right before a blue Dodge van pulled up. She peered through and saw 23-year-old Cameron Hooker in the driver's seat. His wife Janice and their baby daughter were in the back. Colleen felt confident the couple was safe and decided to accept the ride. But once they reached an isolated area, Cameron pulled out a knife and placed a homemade wooden box on top of Colleen's head. She was then brought to the couple's home in Red Bluff, California. Cameron was a lumber worker who had been engaging in violent sexual fantasies using his wife Janice. The two reached an agreement that in place of Janice, Cameron could capture a slave for himself. According to Colleen, once they got home, she was strung up by her hands above the couple's bed. She was physically attacked by Cameron, blindfolded, and left strung up while the couple had sex below her. They were celebrating the capture of their slave. Cameron repeatedly attacked and raped Colleen. Every night she was forced to retire inside a coffin box with only a small hole for air. The box was then slid underneath the couple's bed. Colleen spent most of her time inside this box. At times, she would be let out to watch Cameron and Janice's child or cook for the couple, but most often she would be tortured and violently attacked. Cameron then told Colleen he was working for the company and explained any escaped slaves were hunted down. Their families would also be killed if they ever tried to run away. Cameron reinforced this fear into Colleen, then had her sign a contract stating she was now his slave and that he owned her body and soul. About 3.5 years into her captivity, Cameron took Colleen to visit her family, even leaving her overnight with her parents. She was instructed not to mention anything to them. Out of fear for her and her family's safety, Colleen complied. She didn't tell them anything. The next day, Cameron arrived to pick her up. She got back into his truck and lived for another 3 years inside the coffin box, staying there for up to 23 hours a day. Cameron, by this time, had complete control of Colleen, and she was too afraid to go against him. It wasn't until August of 1984, after 7 years of captivity, that Colleen was finally freed. It was Janice who told Colleen that Cameron wasn't part of the company, but said that it did exist. By this time, Colleen was allowed to get a job as a maid at a motel. Janice also told Colleen she was tortured and brainwashed by Cameron from their very first date and survived by compartmentalizing her ordeal. After she heard all of this, Colleen headed to a bus station, called Cameron and told him she was leaving him. She said he burst into tears. After 3 months, Janice reported Cameron to the authorities. Apparently, prior to Colleen, the couple had abducted, tortured, and murdered 19-year-old Marie Spanicki. But since her body wasn't found, no murder charges were brought. During the trial, Janice testified against Cameron and received full immunity. Cameron was sentenced to 104 years in prison. He was denied parole in 2015 and will be eligible for parole again in 2022. Number 2. Elizabeth Smart. It was the early morning of June 5, 2002, in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah, when 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was roused awake. She was shocked to see a man by her bed. He whispered to her that he had a knife and told her not to make a sound. He let her out of her bedroom and out of the house at knife point. Her sister, Mary Catherine, was in the same bedroom when Elizabeth was taken. She pretended to be asleep, but was actually awake while trying hard to see who was taking her sister. Her testimony later on would prove crucial. Her abductor turned out to be Brian Mitchell. He once worked for the Smarts, helping repair a portion of their roof. Mitchell was raised by devout Mormons and had been married twice before. In his second marriage, he was accused of sexually abusing his son and daughter. After 3 to 5 hours of hiking, Elizabeth reached Michael's campsite. Here, she met Wanda, Mitchell's third wife. She took the girl into a tent, told her to take off her pajamas, and switch to a robe she provided. Afterward, Mitchell came in, proclaimed a ceremony saying Elizabeth was now his wife, and proceeded to rape her. To prevent the young girl from escaping, she was shackled to a tree with metal cable, giving her limited mobility. Mitchell repeatedly raped her, sometimes several times a day. He also forced her to watch sexually explicit films and material, take drugs, drink alcohol, and also have sex with Wanda in front of him so she could learn. Elizabeth was also fed garbage and often starved. Wanda assisted in all of this abuse. Over the time she was held captive, Elizabeth often accompanied Wanda and Mitchell, even in public, but her face was obscured by a veil and she was forced to wear a wig. When they visited a library one time, a patron noticed the trio and called police after seeing Elizabeth's eyes. Although a detective arrived and questioned the trio, Mitchell argued the veil couldn't be removed for religious purposes. Elizabeth was too scared to say anything, and the detectives didn't press any further. Despite the publicity, it wasn't until October 2002 when there was a major break in the case. Mary Catherine suddenly realized the voice of the person she heard that night sounded like that of Emmanuel, a helper they hired for a day to rake leaves and fix the roof. Police were skeptical, but the family took matters into their own hands and had an artist draw a sketch of Emmanuel. When this was released, Brian Mitchell's family recognized the drawing and provided photos of him. By March 12, 2003, Mitchell was spotted with 2 women by a couple who recognized his face on the news. Police took them into custody. Elizabeth initially denied who she was, but finally opened up after realizing she was safe. She was reunited with her family on the same day. It was later revealed that Mitchell also attempted to abduct Elizabeth's cousin weeks after taking her. Brian Mitchell was considered mentally competent and found guilty of kidnapping and transporting a child over state lines for sexual purposes. He was sentenced to life in prison. Meanwhile, Wanda was sentenced to 15 years. She was slated to be released in 2024, but instead was let go early and is now a free woman as of 2018. Number 1. John Jamel Ski. To everyone else, he seemed to be just another elderly gentleman. John T. Jamel Ski was born and lived in Fayetteville, New York, and pretty much lived an ordinary life until he reached his 50s. It was around this time he lost his job. Even though he had inherited a fortune when his father died, which he then invested into real estate in California and Nevada, and was officially a millionaire, he never showed it in how he lived. In fact, he lived quite frugally. He was often seen scavenging and collecting cans and beer bottles. He even arranged for his local library to keep coupons for him. It was also during this time in the 80s when Jamel Ski had an open affair with a teenage girl. He brought the girl to family functions to the awkwardness of his wife, who simply sat by. In his home, he built a 12 by 24 foot bunker, which could only be accessed through a crawl space behind a hidden door inside the garage. He told others he was simply building a storm shelter. Soon after, he began cruising the streets in his vintage Mercury Comet, looking for potential targets. In September of 1988, he lured a 14-year-old girl into his car and down to his secret dungeon. There, he raped her repeatedly. Her family reported her missing, but they were shocked to find her returned home in 1989. The victim never told her family what happened because Jamel Ski threatened to kill her brother, so she only said she ran away from home. Then in 1995, Jamel Ski took another 14-year-old. He held the teen in bondage for 2 whole years, subjecting her to daily sexual assaults while his wife, sick with cancer, was upstairs. He threatened the victim before letting her go in 1997. This time the victim told her mother, but she was so afraid the crime went unreported. In 1997, a 53-year-old Vietnamese immigrant was taken and held for 5 months. After she was released, she told police about what happened, but they never made any in-depth investigation. Jamel Ski's wife then died in 2001, and around this time he also grabbed another victim. It was a 26-year-old single mother. After holding her hostage for 2 months, Jamel Ski let her go too. She rushed to the police, and although she couldn't identify who he was, she told them that he drove a 1975 Mercury Comet. Police searched for the car in the Syracuse area and only found one, but it didn't belong to Jamel Ski. They never expanded the search. Jamel Ski's car was actually a 1974 model. By October of 2002, Jamel Ski took another teen victim. This time it was a 16-year-old that he nicknamed Micah. He was 67 at this time and popped a daily dose of Viagra. He also began treating Micah as a friend. He allowed her in his home and took her out in public, including bowling alleys, karaoke bars, and bottle redemption centers. It was at a bottle run on April 9, 2003 when Micah managed to sneak away and phone her sister. Shortly after, police arrived and he was arrested. His other victims then came forward. When police raided his home, they found his bunker/dungeon. There was a stack of wood for a bed, a crude toilet made of a pail and aluminum framed chair, and a tub filled with water. Jamel Ski genuinely thought he would get off on community service for his crimes. He was found guilty of 5 kidnapping charges, and his possessions were sold off and divided as settlement for his victims. He's currently serving 18 years to life and will be eligible for parole in 2021 when he's 86 years old. So there were the top 5 most frightening kidnapping cases ever. While cases like this show how some people will go to great lengths to satisfy their twisted desires, it also shows how humans can be extremely strong and resilient. The victims in these cases, most of whom survived their ordeal, learned to move on and rebuild their lives in spite of what happened. If you enjoyed watching this video, then please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We have new videos every Wednesday and Saturday that we know you want to check out. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.